Good morning, everybody. If we could find our seats, we'll begin. As you are probably aware, we've got a special guest this morning, Zach Moore. I'll be spending the first half of the class interviewing him, doing a Q&A just between us two, and we can find out a little bit more about who he is and how he ticks as a skeptic of Christianity. And then we'll open up the floor to questions from you guys. And so second half, after we finish our interview here and we begin asking Q&A from you guys, just raise your hand and we'll call on you, and we'll try to keep things moving so that everybody gets a turn. So if you can kind of make your questions brief or concise, not necessarily brief, and to the point, that'll help us get through as many as we can in the time that we have. I'm going to open with a word of prayer from our second Sunday worship guide we've used before. It's a prayer for those who are searching on page 14 of our last week's worship guide. Pray with me. Lord Jesus, you claim to be the way, the truth, and the life. If what you claim is true, please guide me, teach me, and lead me to the reality of who you are. Grant that I might be undaunted by the cost of following you as I consider the reasons for doing so. Give me an understanding that is coherent, convincing, and that leads to the life that you promise. Amen. Good morning, Zach.
Morning.
Glad to have you. Thank you for coming all the way from Keller.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, this early in the morning. I'd like to begin asking you a few questions about who you are so that our people here will get to know you a little bit more. First of all, you know John Wilson,
I
right?
do.
Okay, excellent.
Mm-hmm. Member here.
Yeah. And you co-blog together on Doubting Thomas's.
DoubtingThomases.net.
Okay, excellent. Very good. Well, tell me a little bit about who you are in generally, such as where you're born, religious upbringing, family life, home life, education, profession,
Sure.
Things like that.
Again, welcome, or thank you so much for the welcome here. It's my pleasure. This is actually, for my background, this is actually very much like the church that I grew up in, spent most of my adolescence in, PCA church. I was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, and my parents both had religious backgrounds. My mother was raised Lutheran. My father was raised in a barely even nominally Christian home, although he had a born-again experience late in his high school career and became heavily involved in First Disciples of Christ, and then eventually the Jewish Christian church, Messianic Jewish church specifically, and then he eventually became a Reformed Christian. And I was born over 30 years ago, and don't ask. I don't even really know my own age. I just know that I'm older than 30. And I was raised in the church in a Reformed. We went to a Reformed Baptist church at the time when I was very young, and then eventually we joined a PCA church, and I stayed there pretty much until I went to college. And my parents are still very strong believers. I am not so. I'm now an atheist. So I went through an apostasy several years after I started going to college, actually. And it was kind of an interesting experience for me because it took me by utter surprise. It was not something that I was looking for to happen. I wasn't looking to find fault with God. I wasn't looking to find fault with the church. I never had any problems with church. I never went to a church that I didn't like. I still haven't. There are some churches that are somewhat odd. I will grant that. There's a Pentecostal church near where I live in Keller that's a different breed. But at any rate, I very much enjoyed church, and it really wasn't something that I was looking to give up. Even when I went to college, I knew that there are lots of people that sort of, went away from church or, lost focus on their religious upbringing, and I wasn't really interested in that. I tried to stay active. I joined, several religious groups on campus. I stayed active in my church. even as my brothers did not. And what really changed for me, if I have to point to a specific event or a specific thing that really was the crux of my apostasy, I have to say that it was towards the end of my college career. I took a course on the literature of the Bible, or I should say the Bible as a work of literature. And there were lots of other things, and I've explained this a little bit to BJ already. There are lots of other things that I can look back on that sort of led up to that, and that's laid some, intellectual foundations for that. But really for me, looking at the Bible for the first time as a work of literature and comparing it to other works of literature that have been composed, by different civilizations, by different cultures throughout human history, it really was a sort of a paradigm shift for me because I'd never done that before. I'd always regarded the Bible as a means of divine communication, special revelation. This is God talking to man, and I'd never really given it or placed it on a pedestal where it was at the same level as other works, like the Babylonian scriptures, the Enuma Elish, or the Akkadian scriptures, or other Mesopotamian works that were written either at the same time or even before the Bible was composed. And that, like I said, is an eye-opening experience for me. And once I started to examine it that way, I became very aware of its human influences. And of course, we all pretty much agree that the Bible may be divinely inspired, but it was human composed. There were men, and for the most part, maybe some women, but for the most part, men that wrote the actual words down on actual paper or papyrus or whatever. And and I was okay with that, but then I began to see that there are some passages that I could not reconcile with the idea of those things coming from an all-good deity. And that was, it took me by surprise a little bit, and it was a little difficult to deal with, but I coped for a while by sort of sectioning those things off and saying, well, these verses may be human influence, maybe not divine influence, but I can put a bracket around those, and I can sort of set those to the side, and those don't have to inform my Christian beliefs. And that worked for a while, but the more and more I studied the Bible, and as I began to find these, I became much more interested in seeking them out. And because if there were these problems in the Bible, I wanted to know where they were so I could bracket them off and not have to deal with them. And the more and more I looked, the closer I looked, the more I found, to the point where I eventually asked myself the question. This was actually after one of the final classes. I was sort of walking away down the hallway, and I asked myself the question, if I hadn't been raised to accept this as divine revelation, and I just came across this, would I think it was? And as soon as I asked myself the question, I knew the answer was no, absolutely not. And that was a shock. That was not something that I had been anticipating. It was never a question that I'd asked myself. Maybe it was a question I never had the presence of mind to ask myself. Maybe I hadn't been courageous enough to ask myself. I don't know. But that was pretty much for me the beginning of the end of my Christianity. And I wrestled with that for a while, and eventually I sort of came to terms, and I said to myself, if I don't think that this is divine, I don't think that I can call myself a Christian anymore. And it was disappointing in one sense, but it was also kind of exciting and liberating in another sense, because I sort of began to realize in retrospect that what I had been focused on and what had really thrilled me about the Bible and about Christianity was because it had always been presented to me as the truth. This is the way that reality operates. And what I realized about myself is that it was the truth that was really motivating me. I was really interested in finding out what was true about the world. And all of a sudden I realized that it didn't really bother me so much that Christianity wasn't true, as long as there was something else that was true. So I could sort of put Christianity to the side. I could sort of bracket that off and still pursue the truth and still kind of have meaning and value in my life. So that was, kind of exhilarating and liberating to a certain extent, kind of frightening also, because, now I have this, I thought that I had this worldview all put together and all sewn up. I'd been raised and I'd been given books of doctrine and books from different theologians like, J.I. Packer and Chuck Spurgeon, and I would read them and I'd say, of course. But now it was a different thing that I was facing, and so that was a little scary, but also a little exciting.
Can you bullet point just quickly, like some of those, just highlight the major themes that helped you move away from theism?
Within the Bible?
Either within the Bible, without. I know you'd mentioned previously about professors, other books that you had read.
Yeah. So the Bible, I would say, was first and foremost. That was what was the crux of my apostasy. But I can look back on other things that I'd been interested in, other things that I'd studied that really kind of laid the foundation. When I was very young, I was basically given the run of any library that I visited. My parents encouraged me to read a lot, and I became a very good reader. And they would just, take me to the library and let me roam around and read whatever I thought was interesting, which was great. And I went through sort of different periods where I'd get interested in one topic and read every single book the library had, and then move on to a different one. And one of the subjects that I found fascinating when I was a child was mythology. And I would read all the different books of mythology, all the Greek and Roman myths. I would read even Asian myths, Northern European myths, African myths, Native American myths. I would read all these stories, and I'd just find all these things so fascinating. It sort of eventually led me into fantastic literature and J.R.R. Tolkien, who's I'm really passionate about still, and I would consider my current sacred scripture. But my interest in mythology was a very early age and very highly motivating. As I became older, I became exposed to a scholar named Joseph Campbell that some of you may have heard of. He was basically the premier scholar of world mythology in the 20th century, and wrote the definitive books on Occidental and Oriental mythology. Also wrote a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces, which talks about sort of the heroic monomyth, the idea that every single story that motivates us is a story of a hero going through this basic progression. And the heroes are different. They have different backgrounds. They have different characteristics, but they all have the same basic trajectory in their stories. And this is actually what motivated George Lucas when he wrote Star Wars, and it's one of the reasons why Star Wars is loved by everybody, not just geeks and nerds, as you might expect it to be. But everybody loves that story because it's a representation of that same monomyth. So I became exposed to that, and when I was later, again, looking at the Bible, looking at the stories of the heroes and the other characters in the Bible, I was comparing them to other heroes and characters in other literature, such as the story of Zasudra in Mesopotamian myth, and Gilgamesh also, and you see these same themes come up again. So what Campbell argued was that all cultures basically utilize the same aspects of human psychology to create these stories. And so in that context, the stories that you find in the Old Testament are just another representation of these same stories that the Palestinian peoples would have come up with. The other thing that was a major influence on me was appreciation for critical thinking. And this came about when I was exposed to the books of Carl Sagan. And again, I was relatively young. I was still in high school, and I had my English teacher, in fact, loved Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan had just passed away, and encouraged us all to read The Demon-Haunted World, Science as a Candle in the Dark. And that book is basically a how-to guide to be a critical thinker. Interestingly, it doesn't really deal with religious claims. It deals primarily with paranormal claims, claims about aliens and spaceships and things like that. But the methods are very similar for dealing with those sorts of claims as dealing with religious claims. And I sucked that up, and I really appreciated that. At the time, I wasn't really thinking about using that on my religious worldview, but later, when I began to reevaluate it, then the methods of critical thinking really came in handy, and I started utilizing them and really, sort of trying to be honest with myself and eliminating my bias, eliminating my upbringing in my consideration, saying, look, if I'm going to be fair and compare these sorts of claims to the other sorts of things that, I know and reject, how can I do that? So my appreciation for mythology and my appreciation for critical thinking also were very instrumental.
We'll move a little bit quicker through these next couple. What's your attitude towards Christianity in general and Christians in particular?
I have never met a Christian that I didn't like.
Really?
Met. There are some Christians out there that I have some more negative opinions on, but I haven't met them personally, so I'm still able to say that. No, I think Christians in general are good people. There are people like the Westboro Baptists, for example. They come to town occasionally and they cause a stir, and I think they're very much of a negative representation, and most Christians even are just sick of them. We actually had Nate Phelps in town just on Friday. He was speaking at one of the secular groups in town. He's now an atheist, and he totally rejects his family, and has a very interesting story about growing up the son of Fred Phelps. But yeah, I think that, obviously I'm here, I'm an atheist. I think Christianity is wrong. And I appreciate the opportunity to come here and tell everybody that all your most cherished beliefs are actually untrue. I don't often get that opportunity. Christianity may be wrong, but look, I used to be a Christian, and it's kind of hard for me to be too hard on Christians, on Christianity, because I used to be one, and I came from that tradition. I shared. Like I said, I grew up in a church just like this, so I probably shared every single one of your beliefs. I can take issue, intellectually with certain things. I can also take issue with, socially, how the sort of Christian church in America operates within our culture today. There's several issues that I would differ on, but again, on an individual level, I tend to get along very well with Christians.
What would you consider the biggest holes in the Christian worldview and the biggest strengths, and then compare that to what you would say are some of the biggest holes in atheistic worldview and some of their biggest strengths?
Well, I would say that the biggest, I don't know if I would characterize it as a whole exactly, but the biggest liability for the Christian worldview has to be the Old Testament. There are many passages in the Old Testament that are just awful. And I don't have to tell you any of them, because you've already thought of one or two yourself if you've been reading your Bible. And it's very... a lot of these verses are still used to justify social positions that are basically being rejected by the culture right now. And one of the problems that I see with Christianity is if it does not find a way to sort of divorce itself from certain interpretations of these passages, then it will become culturally irrelevant. Much like Christians in the South 100, 150 years ago interpreted certain passages to support, slavery or bad relations between the races. And there are still Christians today that do that interpret those verses that way. And they are incredibly marginalized. There was just on the internet a few weeks ago, there was a church in Alabama that was advertising a Christian conference for whites only at their church. And this is real. This is something that is in the 21st century. This is an actual thing. Now, granted, what role does that particular church have in the overall church landscape now? Not very much, and that's to be a good thing, I think. But, for example, homosexuality, the way that the church relates to that, there are some churches that are starting to they're looking for a third path. If you're familiar with Greg Boyd, he's an evangelical that is advocating for that. I think he's basically going in the right direction. Look, I don't want to argue theology per se. I don't want to argue interpretation or anything like that. But what I see is that if Christianity follows this interpretation, then it will be increasingly irrelevant within the culture. So that's sort of the biggest liability there. The biggest benefit of Christianity, I would say, is without a doubt its ability to provide hope to the hopeless. It's masterful at that. I was at a debate with Christopher Hitchens. He was in town several years ago. He was actually debating, I think it was 5 other Christians at once. It was kind of amusing. But the editor of Christianity Today was there moderating the debate and asked Hitchens, he said, look, even if we grant that you are the intellectual superior to us and that atheism is correct, this gentleman, I can't remember his name, but he had polio or he was crippled in some way, and he said that every day for me is a physical struggle. I wake up in the morning and I'm in pain, and getting out of bed is a painful thing. Putting my clothes on is a painful thing, and this is never going to go away from me because of my condition. And he said, part of what Christianity offers me is hope that, in the next life, my body will be made whole and I won't have to deal with this pain and this suffering on a constant basis. And so, Christopher, what do you have to offer me from the atheist worldview? And Hitchens did a lot of hand-waving. He basically played down how great Christianity is, but he didn't really offer a proper response, which I thought was unfortunate. And that's not to say that somebody who is in pain and who is suffering can't find hope, can't find some relief if they're an atheist, if they're a humanist. But I think that the systems that are in place, the ideas that are in place within Christianity meet that need so well that it's more of a struggle on the humanist side, on the atheist side, to provide that to people. Again, not to say that it can't be done. It's just not as readily available. It's a little bit more counterintuitive.
We just have a few more minutes to go through our questions together before we ask for questions from the audience. Mm-hmm. But real quickly, what is the biggest hole, biggest strength of the atheistic worldview, or the biggest liability, I guess?
The biggest liability is in part what I just said about the strength of Christianity, is that it does that much better than atheism. There's other liabilities. There's lots of liabilities, of course. Atheism is not perfect. I'm not here to say that it is. I'm only saying that it's right. I'm not saying that you're going to have a better life necessarily if you become an atheist. I would say that my life probably has become a little bit more interesting. I don't know that it's actually better. It's definitely more interesting. I feel a little bit more free to pursue things, to pursue beliefs that I may not have been able to pursue otherwise. But that can also be terribly frightening, and that can be an existential challenge for people to grapple with this. It's not always a decision that's made with great rejoicing. When people come into Christianity and they make that choice, or they are moved by the Spirit or whatever, that's usually something that is heralded with great rejoicing, right? Everybody's thrilled when somebody comes into the fold. It's not always the case for somebody that comes into atheism. There's a gentleman that I know, a friend of mine, who grew up Christian all his life, went to the church, was very active in his church here in Dallas. Active with the youth program, with the kids, outreach, missions, all that kind of stuff. And he ended up having a little bit of time on his hands and wanted to investigate the intellectual reasons for why he was a Christian. And that actually led him in the opposite direction. The more he investigated, the more he found questionable, and he ended up as an atheist, in fact. And when that happened, that terrified him. It absolutely terrified him. And he was in a very bad place for probably over a year, I would say. He eventually screwed up the courage to come out and meet with us, in one of our atheist organizations. But it was so personally difficult for him to do this that he actually had to stop at a convenience store, buy a 6-pack of beer, drive to the restaurant where we were meeting, sit in the parking lot, and drink that entire 6-pack before he could even walk in the door. And even after that, he had to go through lots of counseling to deal with that shift over. And he lost his wife over it. He lost his best friend from kindergarten. They've known each other for 30 years, and the guy won't return phone calls anymore. So it's a very difficult road to hoe for some people. So that is the biggest problem with atheism, is that there's an intense solitude sometimes, and I felt it too, to a certain extent. I didn't really have that dramatic of an experience, but when I asked that question of myself, as I told you, I had nobody that I knew that had ever gone through anything like that. Everybody that I knew was Christian. Everybody in my family was Christian. All my friends were Christian. I had nobody to compare my experiences with, nobody to share notes with. I could, go online. The internet was around, so I could go online and find people that were having their experiences, and I could sort of read that. But I couldn't sit down with anybody. I couldn't, commiserate or anything like that. And so it was, a solitary thing for a while that I really didn't share with anybody. And really it took me moving from Ohio, where I was born, down here to Texas, where I began to find groups of atheists and other non-believers and free thinkers in this area that were meeting, and it was an incredible opportunity. And so I couldn't. Actually, the first time that I did, there was a church that invited.
I got to move you along a little bit quicker.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I apologize.
Sorry. I'll just say that the first thing that brought me out was actually a church that invited an atheist to come speak, very much like what you're seeing here today. And I'd seen it posted online, and I thought to myself, well, there's no way that I can't go to that. And so I did. And so that actually involved me with the atheist community here in Dallas, and it also got me involved in attending churches on a regular basis. So
another question. Often we think of atheism and evolution as synonymous, or inextricably connected. What do you think of Christians who hold to a theistic view of evolution, or that God uses evolution as his creative vehicle in some capacity?
Well, that was me. I mean, when I was a Christian, I accepted evolutionary theory as I accepted pretty much every other scientific theory that's held.
And you have a PhD in biology, right?
I do. I have a PhD in molecular biology, so I know what I'm talking about, so to speak. No, that's not true. Actually, if you have a PhD, it just means that you have a learner's permit to learn about things. You're not an expert in everything. But I did. I studied a lot of science, and for me, it was never really that big of a question. Of course, if God can do anything, of course He can create things through any mechanism, whether it's evolutionary or otherwise. So that was never that big of a problem for me. Although I was never, I was a little bit more, not quite as evangelical as some of our, or fundamentalists, I would say, as some of our Christian brothers and sisters are. So I never thought of that as a fight that I needed to fight, either for myself or for other people. I just thought that anybody that needed to do that either, were being too literal with the Bible, or they had too small of a God that couldn't handle that. I think, theistic evolutionists, I think that's great. Evolution is part of science, right? There's no reason to call it out as being something different. There's no reason to have any objection to it. why would you have an objection to any particular theory in science? Evolutionary theory, cell theory, germ theory. I think the only reason that people do call it out is because they're committed to a fundamentalist worldview where they have to interpret the first chapters of Genesis in a very literal way. And then that theory then, contradicts their worldview. And the theistic evolutionists, and there are some brilliant ones. Francis Collins, who is the director of the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, very important guy, very brilliant guy. He was also the former director of the Human Genome Project. Fantastic work. I can't speak for his evangelical beliefs. I certainly don't agree with him there. But if you're interested in his take on it, he's written a book called The Language of God that illustrates that. There's another gentleman that I would recommend. He's actually a Catholic named Kenneth Miller. He teaches at Brown, and he's written a book called Finding Darwin's God, which is another book that I would strongly recommend to anybody who is interested in evolution from a theistic point of view.
Very good. Final question before we take questions from the audience. That doesn't mean don't pay attention. It just means have your question ready. What would it take for you to change your mind about the existence of God, and what sort of evidence would you require?
That's an excellent question. If I'm being totally honest, I really don't know. I didn't really know what it would take to make me not a Christian at the time, so I don't know that I can look back and say what I would need now. I like to give a kind of a flippant answer, and I say, I would like at least what Thomas got, doubting Thomas, who got to see the risen Christ and got the offer to put his hands in the holes, although he didn't apparently take him up on it. But so I would like at least that, and I think, and the only person who would really know would be, of course, God. If there is a God, certainly He knows what it would take to change my heart. And if I am one of the reprobates, then possibly there's nothing that would change my heart. Who knows? I've met some people, some Calvinistically inclined people that say that I'm just not one of the elect, and there's nothing for me. And I've met other Calvinistically inclined people that say, well, based on my past, and that I probably am, and I will continue to be preserved, even though apparently now I am backslidden, or however what you want to call it. Of course, the Baptists think I can go back and forth. And so maybe who knows? But I'm not. Whatever the case may be, I'm not opposed to it. So I'm not an atheist dogmatically. I'm an atheist because that's where my search for truth led me, and I'm certainly not opposed to going back to Christianity. I'm certainly not opposed to going to Islam or Buddhism or Hinduism or anything else that's made apparent to me. I just, I'll whatever it will take is whatever is necessary for that process to happen. So. And
you've read the Bible a number of times, right?
Yeah. That's
so cover to cover. About how many times would you say you read the Bible?
when I was younger, I had to read a book of the Bible every week, and so I probably a dozen times.
Okay. All right. So you're familiar with this concept?
I'm relatively familiar with this concept.
Very good. Hey, thank you so much for letting me pick your brain. I'd like to extend the opportunity to everybody here as well.
Okay.
If that's okay with you. Any questions?
I have a couple of questions.
Yes,
okay, let's make them brief and to the point, please.
You were raised in the faith, growing up and everything, and I hear a very intelligent, educated man, and so forth and so on. As you were growing up, did you ever consider what the Scriptures teach, especially when you talk about personal relationship to Christ as your Savior? Have you prayed? Have people prayed for you, or have you prayed?
Since I became an atheist?
What do you think about prayer? Let's just simplify it.
Well, so what do I think about prayer? I think, so I'm a scientist, right? I'm trained as a scientist, and so I sort of go along with So what do people say about prayer? Is prayer efficacious? If you pray for something, does it actually happen?
Well, it's a communication.
Right. But a lot of things that people communicate are requests to God, right? And
Sometimes it's
right, sure. There have been some studies done, some large studies done on the efficacy of prayer in a medical context, in fact. And the largest study that was done is called the Mantra 2 study, and they had people who went in for heart surgery, and they were assigned either to be prayed about or just to have people think about them, not pray for them, but just keep them in their thoughts. And they wanted to see if prayer itself would have an effect. And they had thousands of patients in the study, so they should have been able to see something. It was very well statistically powered, and I think supported by some government research money, in fact. What they found, in fact, was that prayer did appear to do something. It appeared to actually make people worse, in fact. And I'm not joking, just by a little bit. But here's the caveat. So in the study, they actually let the patients know if they were being prayed for or if they were not being prayed for. And the patients that were being prayed for actually had more side effects, and I don't know if they actually lived shorter lives after that, but they had more things go wrong with them. Just sort of random things. And of course, on one hand, certainly the prayer didn't help them. But on the other hand, so why did it have a negative effect, even a very small one? And the supposition is that, well, these patients knew that they were being prayed for. They may have thought, oh gosh, am I really that bad off that people are praying for me? Like they're getting hundreds of people in churches to pray for me. And they may have thought to themselves, I must be in really bad shape, and sort of had a psychosomatic effect. So, and then that leads to what my overall impression is about prayer, that it is a psychosomatic thing, that there are similarities between prayer and other similar types of activities like meditation. In fact, scientists have done brain scans. They'll do functional MRI scans of people in deep prayer, professionally religious people in deep prayer, and they compare them to people from different religions, like Buddhist monks, and they see them in deep meditation, and you see the same regions of the brain lighting up and shutting off in both groups. So I think it does invoke some sort of a neurological phenomenon, but it does not appear to be, at least for me, anything that's related to the spiritual. Now, I used to pray, and I used to have, I don't know if I would call it a personal relationship with God, but I used to talk to God all the time, conversationally, and sort of be in a constant state of prayer. And it was very comforting to me at the time, and that was one of the things that it was kind of sad for me to give up. But looking back, I sort of see that I can still do that. I can still sort of talk to myself. And that is still kind of comforting. And it does help me especially if I'm wrestling through some problem. I can just, sit in a quiet place and talk to myself and talk myself through the problem. And it usually does sort of resolve itself. And I usually do come to some conclusion, and I feel good about that. So I think that the same processes may be in place.
Simplify that. If you have Christian parents that are very devout, they haven't given up praying on for you.
Oh, no, yes.
And guess what? The Holy Spirit will not give up on you.
All right, next question, Greg.
Let us hope.
I guess my question would be, I think my wife was mentioning about being good.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about, I guess, overall morality,
mm-hmm.
where do you find your, what makes right? How do you, outside of a Christian framework, determine what is right, what is good? What I mean?
Oh, yeah.
Where is your, I threw away, let's say, the Christian compass,
mm-hmm.
and you felt very free. How, do you have a framework for another morality, or is it more of an anarchist kind of, hey, or is it pure freedom?
Right. Yeah. So I actually am leaving here and going to our atheist orgy up the street. I'm kidding. No. That's an excellent question, in fact, and that is something that I wrestled with, because that's the providing a moral foundation is another thing that Christianity does really well, and all religious traditions all provide some moral context for people, and so if you don't have that, where does your morality come from? And what I found is there's no really easy answer. I don't think there's anything quite as simple as, well, there's certainly nothing external. There's no person telling us what's right? So that's the big difference. You find that typically in most religious traditions, that you have a God or something like that that tells you what to do, and you do that, or at least tells you what the basic principles are. For me, as an atheist, so I've been investigating that, and one of the things I found is that my moral instincts point me in the direction of the reciprocity ethic, right? Which is basically do unto others as you would do unto them, or as you would have them do unto you, which is part of the Christian ethic tradition, which is part of the Jewish ethic tradition, which is part of Buddhist, and basically most world religions have the same ethic at their core, the reciprocity ethic. And I find that to be to resonate with me as a humanist. I live in a world. I'm a human being. I live in a world with other human beings. My actions impact others. Their actions impact me. So that ethic makes sense. Just even if there's no God, it makes sense to treat people like that. And I also find that my primary ethical desire is to pursue happiness. And again, my happiness is dependent on the happiness of other people. And if other people aren't happy, then the conditions are not good for me to be happy either. So I want to create conditions where as many people can be as happy as possible. So if you take those two things, if you take the ethic of reciprocity, and if you take pursuing happiness and trying to eliminate suffering, it may not address every situation, but you'd be surprised how far you could go, ethically speaking, with that. And you don't need a God to figure that out. The other thing, of course, is that you learn that morality is not absolute, right? As many religious traditions teach, Christianity included. Let's take lying, for example, right? So it's bad to give false testimony. It's bad to lie, and yet you can imagine certain conditions, certain situations where actually lying would be the best thing to do. For example, if there's a rapid knock at your door and you open it up and there's a woman there and she's bruised and beaten and bloody, and she tells you that her boyfriend is chasing her and he's been beating her up and he's threatened to kill her, and please can I hide in your house? And you let her in, and she's hiding in your house. A few minutes later, there's another knock at the door, and there's this big, beefy guy, and he's pissed off, and he's angry, and this is the boyfriend. He's like, have you seen this woman? When he asks you that question, you lie. You lie with a clear conscience, because that is absolutely the right thing to do at that point in time. You do not want to, maybe you don't say, no, I haven't seen her, but you're going to deceive him in some way. You're not going to give him the honest truth, which is that she's in your house, in fact. And that is the absolute right thing to do. That is the moral thing to do in that situation. So that's just one example. But one of the things that I've learned is that there is a little bit of relativistic morality that's at play. It depends on the situation, depends on who's involved, and so in my experience, the way that I approach things seems to work out a little bit more. To be a little bit more flexible and allow for those sorts of situations. And it doesn't create those ethical conundrums quite so much for me.
Hey, Greg, let me jump to another one. Patty? Or Gary?
think everybody's written out the filtering and not afraid always, but how do you say to the non-community or to the country with slavery questions that how do you say that's wrong? You say for you, I'm going to make you happy. How do you say to somebody like that? That's up to me, but if you do
Well, so what you're describing is like absolute relative morality, right? And that's not exactly what I'm saying. If Hitler were in front of me, I'd say you're wrong. That's how I would say it. I'd say you're wrong. My humanistic values. I would say you are causing suffering, and you're not treating people in the way that you would want to be treated. Why should I care about? Well, he might not. I can't. He might not care, and I couldn't force him to care. But even if I were a Christian, I couldn't force him to care. Right. Yeah, so I can't threaten him with hellfire. That's definitely true. Yeah.
You can't say you're wrong.
No, I can't. I can say you're wrong. And I would. Happily.
So you could disagree over who your final authority is on right and wrong.
No, yeah.
That's what I hear you guys saying. Like, Gary is approaching it from God as the authority, and it sounds like what you're saying is that you would be your authority.
Well, let me ask you this. If you went up to Hitler, let's say, and you said, God thinks that you're wrong, do you think that would make any impact on him?
Well, it's not really my question for whether it's impacts or not. Based on your worldview.
Yeah.
How do you say what somebody else is doing is wrong? Now, I know you want to, but how do you support that?
By what I just said.
It's just, that's your morality. How do you say what is morality?
Well, I can say that you should not cause suffering to other people. Well, yeah, he can always say so what. He can say so what to anybody.
How do you justify for him to not do it?
Because I'll tell him that the situation that he's creating is not a good situation for him.
So if we ratchet that up a level to maybe help make this a little clearer, you approach Hitler, you both tell him you're wrong.
Yeah.
You say the humanist in me says that you're wrong for this. Gary says the Christian in me,
right.
Not that there's a little Christian in him, but that God's laws say that what you're doing is wrong.
Right.
If you don't stop doing this, where does the authority come to enforce anything that he's against a person who is transgressing some moral law, regardless of whose law it is, whether it's your law or God's law? How would you make a claim to authority on an appeal to somebody who's violating your moral law?
No, you don't make any appeals to authority. As a free thinker, you don't appeal to authority. That's one of the key components. That you don't appeal to authority. You appeal to evidence. You appeal to reason. That's it. So I would appeal to evidence and reason. Matt.
Within your worldview and given your scientific background, do you believe in anything supernatural on any level, or do you believe that at some point science will explain all of the things that we don't see as explainable in our current human law?
Well, that's putting a pretty big burden on science to explain everything.
Given decades and centuries of time, obviously we understand a lot more about the universe now than we did
Sure.
years ago.
Sure.
And we've got about 3 minutes left, so
Okay.
solve all of life's problems in 3 minutes with this answer.
I'm just curious from your perspective. Obviously there are things that science can't explain, but I'm not saying that you would necessarily see some of those things as being supernatural. Is there room for supernatural within your system?
Yes. If you read the works of Victor Stenger, in fact, he's a physicist from the University of Hawaii, and he's written on this a lot. If the natural laws were suspended, for example, if I started floating, if something like that were to happen, that would be a clear piece of evidence that there is something supernatural at work. But we haven't really seen that. We don't have good evidence of that. We have, there are people that are cured of certain maladies that is often heralded as miracles. What we don't see, though, are people with amputated limbs, where the limbs regrow, which would be a clear violation of what we understand about biology. That would be presumably something supernatural. So that would be something that would be evidence in the favor of supernaturalism, and we just haven't seen that. The history of science has been one where things that were thought to be supernatural have since then been discovered. For example, germ theory, right? So it was thought that for a while,
like 1 minute left,
that we had certain humors in our bodies that controlled things, and science disproved that. It used to be thought that there was some sort of orgone rays or energy that filtered through and caused life, and that's been disproved by science. So the history of science is one where we find continually more natural explanations, and the supernatural explanations sort of fall by the wayside. So I would presume that to continue to be the case.
So that's unfortunately all the time that we have. I hope you can stick around for a few minutes, perhaps.
I will.
Okay. I encourage you guys to check out Zach's blog, doubtingthomas.net, where he co-blogs with our own John Wilson, and as well as look at some of the other things that he takes great interest in as from a humanist perspective. Very involved in the community with charities, with
LLS today,
and Camp Quest, which is a non-religious children's
summer camp,
and a number of other things as well. So please take a look at those things, and I'd love for you guys to ask him questions in the time between service and our Sunday school class. He will have to scoot out here at some point, so please let him do so. He actually said he would if he didn't have other things.
On a different day, I would have stayed.
Another Sunday. But anyway, thank you guys for your questions. And if you've got children in childcare, please go get them before going downstairs for refreshments or hanging out in here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.